Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Mango Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. It all started with a malfunctioning debit card. I was standing at the gas pump, swiping my card repeatedly, each attempt followed by the same annoying beep and a blinking error message on the screen. Frustrated, I pulled out the credit card I shared with my wife. Gwen, we'd always agreed on transparency when it came to our finances, but as the gas pumped, I decided to check the account balance through my phone just to see how much damage we were doing. And that's when I saw a charge from a hotel I'd never been to. At first, I thought it was a mistake, maybe fraud or a weird glitch in the system, but something about it gnawed at me, a familiar kind of dread settling in my gut. Without telling Gwen, I scrolled through our shared account history. There it was again, another hotel charge. Twice in 1 week? Suspicious restaurant bills from places I'd never heard of. For a second, my hand shook, trying to convince myself it was all some misunderstanding, that my wife wasn't the kind of woman who could. No, not Gwen. I got back in the car, my mind racing. Instead of heading home, I drove to that hotel. It wasn't too far away, and I knew if I didn't go, I'd never stop wondering. I had to know. As I pulled into the parking lot, I saw Gwen's car there, parked neatly in the shadows like she didn't want it to be noticed. My heart was pounding, and my vision narrowed as I approached the building. She wasn't here for work. That much was clear. For a second, I thought about just leaving, pretending I hadn't seen anything, but that was never going to be enough for me, not after everything we'd built together. I walked inside, scanning the lobby with quick, panicked glances, hoping I wouldn't see her but needing to at the same time. I didn't have to look for long. They walked right past me, Gwen and a man I'd never seen before, laughing, holding hands, oblivious to the world around them. My chest tightened as the air was sucked out of my lungs. Her smile, that familiar, radiant smile she used to save for me, was now for someone else. And the way she looked at him, my vision blurred for a second, the weight of the moment pressing down on me like a ton of bricks. I could have confronted her right there. I could have yelled, made a scene. But instead, I stood frozen, rooted to the spot. They didn't even notice me as they walked past, wrapped up in their own little world. The thought hit me like a truck. I didn't exist to her anymore, at least not in that moment. I left the hotel without saying a word. As I drove home, a cold clarity washed over me. I wasn't going to scream or fight. No, I had a plan forming in my head. By the time I walked into our house that evening, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I logged into our bank account and methodically withdrew almost all of our savings. Every dollar we had worked so hard for over the years, I funneled into an account under my name alone. It felt like the only way to take back some control in this nightmare. Then I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the door, waiting for her to come home. I didn't know when, but I knew she would. And when she did, the truth would spill out one way or another. It was ironic, really. If my debit card hadn't malfunctioned at the gas pump, I might have never discovered the truth. But now, my marriage was hanging by a thread, and Gwen didn't even know it yet. Gwen walked through the door like it was any other night, shrugging off her coat and tossing her purse onto the couch. She barely glanced in my direction, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. I stayed silent for a moment, watching her, letting the weight of my discovery settle between us. It was strange seeing her like that, so normal, so comfortable after what I had just witnessed. "Hey, Jules," she said casually, smiling as if nothing was wrong. "How was your day?" I could feel my blood boiling beneath my skin, my muscles tensing as I tried to control the anger surging through me. But I didn't want to explode. Not yet. I needed her to say it. I needed to hear her admit it. "How was your day?" I asked, my voice tight, barely masking the fury inside me. She glanced at me, a little confused, sensing something off. "It was fine," she said, her eyes flickering toward her purse like she was already distracted. I stood up from the chair, moving slowly, my body coiled like a spring. Funny because I went by the Lancaster Hotel today. Her whole demeanor changed. It was like watching a wave crash over her, the color draining from her face as she realized what I was saying. The smile vanished, and her eyes widened in panic. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I didn't wait for her to collect herself. "I saw you, Gwen, you and him, holding hands, walking together, like I don't even exist." Silence. Her mouth opened again, but still nothing. I could see her mind racing, trying to come up with an explanation, a lie, anything to make it all go away, but she knew it was too late. "Julian," she began, her voice trembling. "Just tell me the truth." I cut her off, my voice shaking with the effort to keep myself in check. "Tell me how long this has been going on." She swallowed hard, her eyes darting around the room like she was searching for an escape, but there was no way out. Slowly, she sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "A few months," she whispered, barely audible. "It started a few months ago." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Months. My wife had been living a double life for months, and I had been none the wiser. "Why, Gwen?" I asked, my voice cracking despite myself. "Why the hell didn't you just come to me? Why not talk to me?" She lifted her head, her eyes red with unshed tears. "Because it's not just the affair, Julian, it's everything. I've been so unhappy for months. Longer than that, really?" I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "Unhappy?" I echoed, stunned. "What are you talking about? We've been fine. We have a house, jobs. What the hell are you talking about? She shook her head, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. You don't get it, do you? I feel trapped in this life. Trapped in this marriage I never wanted. This. The house, the responsibilities, being someone's wife. It's suffocating me. I thought I could do it. I thought I could be happy with you. But I'm not. I haven't been for a long time. Her words sliced through me like a knife, each one worse than the last. I had been bracing for a confession about the affair, but this was worse. This was her admitting that our entire marriage was a lie, that everything we had built together was meaningless to her. So, what I asked, my voice thick with disbelief, you've just been faking it. Pretending to be happy all this time while screwing some guy behind my back. She flinched, but she didn't deny it. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you, Jules, I didn't know how to get out. I let out a bitter laugh, my head spinning. Get out? You wanted out. Yes, she met my gaze then, her eyes raw and filled with regret. I've been thinking about it for months. I've wanted a divorce for a long time now, but I was scared. Scared of what it would do to you, to us. I didn't want to lose everything. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. All this time she had been living in some secret world of dissatisfaction, planning her escape while I had no clue, and she thought an affair was the answer? I stepped closer, towering over her, barely containing my rage. Well, congratulations, I said coldly. You're going to get exactly what you want. She looked up at me, confused. What do you mean? I mean, I'm done. I'm leaving you. I've already withdrawn most of our savings, half of what we built. That's mine. You can take the rest and go live with your new boyfriend for all I care. I could see the shock on her face as she realized I had already started preparing for the end. She wasn't the only one with a plan. What she blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of my words. You did what? I saw this coming from a mile away. You think I'm stupid? I took the money. Gwen, I'm filing for divorce. You've got your way out. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't care. Not anymore. My heart was a block of ice in my chest. I wasn't going to be her safety net, her fallback plan. She could deal with the fallout, just like I was going to have to. I never meant for it to go this far, Julian, she whispered, shaking her head. I never wanted to hurt you like this. You didn't just hurt me, I snapped. You destroyed everything. The air between us crackled with tension, and I turned away, unable to look at her any longer. My mind was a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and something darker that I didn't want to acknowledge. I had never felt so small, so insignificant in my own marriage. I'll be out by tomorrow, I said, my voice hollow, as I headed for the door. You can have the house. It's already over. But just as I reached for the handle, I stopped. Her voice, soft and broken, echoed behind me. Julian, please. I didn't turn back. I walked out into the night, leaving the shattered remains of my marriage behind me. I drove for hours that night, the empty roads stretching endlessly ahead of me. The radio was off, and the only sound was the steady hum of the engine beneath me. But inside my head, there was nothing but noise. Gwen's words, her betrayal, the way she admitted to wanting out for months, it all swirled together, mixing with memories I hadn't let myself revisit in years. It felt like I was a kid again, standing in the wreckage of a broken family, wondering why it all had to fall apart. Except this time it wasn't my parents, it was me. I don't know when I pulled over, but eventually I parked the car at a lookout point that gave a view of the city below. The twinkling lights, the quiet night, it all seemed so peaceful, so far removed from the chaos tearing me apart. I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the steering wheel as the memories flooded in, uninvited and unwanted. My mother had cheated on my father, over and over. I didn't understand it back then, but I knew something was wrong. I was only about 7 years old when the whispers started. My father, Adam, a man who had dedicated his life to working hard for his family, was the kind of guy you could depend on. But my mother, Lorraine, was the opposite, a whirlwind of chaos, always chasing excitement, always needing something more. I remember the shouting late at night, the fights, the smashed glass. Dad would be home from a long day at the plant, exhausted, just wanting a quiet evening. And then I'd hear her, screaming at him, accusing him of not giving her enough attention. It was always something with her. And then there were the times she wouldn't come home at all, leaving my sister Lily, and me to wonder where the hell she'd gone. It wasn't until much later that I learned the truth. My father had always suspected her of cheating, but he never had proof, never wanted to believe it. He kept making excuses for her, kept hoping she'd change. And then, one day, she didn't come home for 3 nights straight. That was when everything crumbled. My dad found out where she was shacked up in some cheap motel with another man. He confronted her, begged her to come back, to fix things, for the sake of the family. But she laughed at him. She laughed in his face, told him she didn't want to be tied down anymore, that she was done pretending to be a wife and mother. She was done with us. He came back a broken man. I still remember him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, like the life had been sucked out of him. The next morning he was gone. He had driven his car into a tree just outside of town, dead on impact. Mom didn't even shed a tear. After that, it was just me, Lily, and my mom. And it didn't take long for things to spiral out of control. Mom was never around. She had men in and out of the house like it was a revolving door. And Lily, she was only 14, started to follow in her footsteps, hanging out with the wrong crowd, skipping school, sneaking out at night. She wanted to be like Mom, wanted the attention, the thrill of it all. I tried to keep her grounded. Tried to remind her what it had done to Dad, but she didn't listen. How could she? She saw Mom living it up, no consequences. What she didn't realize was how hollow it all was, how it destroyed everything in its path. By the time Lily was 17, she was pregnant. The guy who knocked her up disappeared the moment he found out, and she was left with nothing but a baby on the way and a shattered future. And then, one night, she just couldn't handle it anymore. She overdosed in her bedroom. I was the one who found her. I'll never forget that moment. The way she looked so small and fragile, the way I screamed for help, even though I knew it was too late, the way my mother sat in the living room, stone-faced, like none of it mattered, like it was just another mess to clean up. That was when I swore I'd never let myself get pulled into that kind of pain. I'd never let a woman have that kind of power over me. But here I was, all these years later, living the same damn nightmare. Gwen had done the one thing I thought I'd protected myself from. She had betrayed me, just like my mother had betrayed my father. And the worst part, she didn't even have the decency to be sorry about it. She wasn't sad that she'd hurt me. She was relieved. Relieved that it was finally over, that she could be free to live the life she wanted, just like my mother. I clenched my fists, my knuckles white as the memories and the rage boiled inside me. This was why I never trusted anyone completely, why I never let myself get too close. I thought I had learned from my parents' mistakes. From what happened to Lily, I thought I had built walls strong enough to keep the hurt out. But it didn't matter. It found its way in anyway. I gritted my teeth, my jaw aching from the tension. I wanted to scream, to break something, to make the pain stop. But there was nothing I could do. Gwen was just another reminder that I couldn't trust anyone, that no matter how much you give, how hard you try, people will always let you down. I had seen firsthand what betrayal could do to a person, what it could do to a family. My father's death had been the beginning of the end for us, and now it felt like history was repeating itself. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had never truly escaped the shadow of my mother's actions. Her betrayal had shaped everything: my distrust, my need for control, my refusal to let anyone get too close. And Gwen had walked right into that old wound, ripping it wide open, just like my mother had done to my father. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about the lies, the deception, the way she had been planning her escape while I was in the dark. It was about the betrayal of trust, the destruction of everything we had built together. I had always thought I was different, that I wouldn't end up like my father, broken and defeated by a woman's betrayal. But sitting there in my car, staring at the city below, I realized I was more like him than I wanted to admit. The law office was sterile, clean, and cold. Everything about it, from the glass walls to the meticulously organized desks, reeked of efficiency. No room for sentimentality or warmth. That was exactly what I needed right now. I wasn't here for comfort. I was here for solutions. I sat across from my lawyer, Jennifer Holt, who had come highly recommended. She was sharp, no nonsense, and most importantly, ruthless when it came to cases like mine. I had no intention of letting Gwen walk away with more than what she deserved. Hell, I didn't want her to get anything at all. But that wasn't how these things worked, so I was here to make sure she got the absolute bare minimum. Jennifer slid the paperwork across the desk, her fingers tapping lightly on the stack of documents. These outline your assets, both shared and individual. I've highlighted everything that can be protected, specifically your inheritance. Now, if Gwen contests, she'll likely try to go after the shared accounts, but I've got everything in place to make sure you walk away with the majority of what's left. I nodded, my eyes scanning the papers even though the words blurred together. None of this felt real yet. It was like I was watching it happen to someone else. I've already withdrawn most of the savings, I said, feeling a strange satisfaction in the words. I moved it into a private account under my name. Jennifer gave me a sharp look of approval. Smart, that's going to make things a lot easier. As for the house, we'll need to discuss what you want to do. If you're planning on selling, that'll be another division of assets, but we can limit her take. If she's been living there, and you haven't, we can argue that the value she gets is decreased by her occupancy. I hadn't thought about the house much. It had been our home, filled with memories, both good and bad, but now, the thought of Gwen staying there, living her life with someone else in the place we built together, made my stomach churn. Sell it, I said, my voice firm. I want it gone. Let her find some other place to shack up. Jennifer nodded, jotting down notes. Understood. We'll get the ball rolling on that. Now, regarding your inheritance. I stiffened at the mention of it. My inheritance was the last tie I had to my father. When he died, he had left Lily and me a small fortune, money he had saved up through years of hard work. After Lily passed, her share came to me. I hadn't touched most of it, keeping it as a sort of insurance for the future. Gwen had always known about it, but we'd never needed to dip into it. Now, that money was the one thing I refused to let her get her hands on. I want it protected, I said, my tone dark. She doesn't get a cent of that. Jennifer glanced up from her notes. That's easily done. Your inheritance is considered separate property. as long as it wasn't commingled with shared assets. Did you ever transfer any of that money into your joint accounts? I shook my head. No, I made sure of that. It's always been kept separate. Good, Jennifer replied, her face betraying nothing but professionalism. That money is yours, untouchable. She won't be able to claim any of it. The only assets she'll have access to are the ones that were shared during the marriage. And even then, we'll make sure her portion is as small as possible. I leaned back in the chair, feeling a small sense of relief. It was cold, calculated, but it was the only comfort I could take right now. Gwen had already taken so much from me, my trust, my dignity, my belief in us. The least I could do was make sure she didn't get a free ride out of the deal. Jennifer glanced at the clock on the wall before looking back at me. Is there anything else you'd like to discuss? Any other financial concerns? For a moment, I hesitated, but then the words spilled out. I don't trust women, I said bluntly. Not anymore. This isn't just about Gwen, my mother. She ruined my father's life. And now, Gwen's done the same to me. I'm not going to let anyone take advantage of me like that again. Jennifer's eyes softened, just for a moment, as if she understood. But she was a professional, and she quickly returned to the matter at hand. It's not uncommon to feel that way after something like this, she said, but you've taken all the right steps. You've protected yourself financially. And with the divorce proceedings in motion, you're ensuring that Gwen won't be able to exploit you further. I gave a bitter chuckle. Exploit me? She already has. I just didn't see it coming. Jennifer paused for a beat, then nodded. You're right. And that's why we're making sure this ends on your terms. I appreciated her directness. I didn't need pity or sympathy. I just needed results. I've arranged to sell most of the shared belongings, I said after a moment, changing the subject. Furniture, art, whatever. I don't want any of it. It can all go. She can have whatever's left over, but I'm not taking anything from that house except what's mine. Jennifer scribbled down more notes, keeping up with my rapid-fire decisions. We'll include that in the final division. If you're not attached to any of the shared assets, that's fine. It'll make the split cleaner. I sighed, feeling the weight of the situation bear down on me again. The practicalities of divorce were almost worse than the emotional devastation. It was one thing to feel the pain of betrayal, but having to go through the motions of splitting up a life we'd built together, down to the last piece of furniture, it felt like tearing away chunks of myself. Once the paperwork is signed, Jennifer said, her voice steady, you'll be free to move forward. I know this process feels cold, but it's about protecting yourself and ensuring that you're not left vulnerable. Yeah, I muttered, staring down at the floor. I get it. We wrapped up the meeting, and Jennifer assured me she'd file everything within the next couple of days. I thanked her, even though it felt strange to say the words, and left the office, feeling slightly more in control but no less hollow inside. That evening, I went home for what I planned to be the last time. Gwen was sitting in the living room, looking as if she had spent the whole day on the couch. The once pristine house we had shared was now a stranger's place to me, filled with reminders of what used to be. I had no desire to stay any longer than I had to. I stood in the doorway, letting the silence stretch before I spoke. It's done. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with confusion. What do you mean? The divorce, I said, my voice cold. I've already met with the lawyer. I've taken half the savings, the house is going to be sold, and the rest of our shared belongings will be sold off. You can keep whatever's left. Her mouth opened, but she didn't say anything. She hadn't expected me to move so fast. Hell, maybe she thought I'd take longer to process all this, or that I'd somehow beg her to stay. But no. I was done. I'll be out of here by tomorrow, I continued. You can figure out what you want to do after that. She finally spoke, her voice small. You're really leaving. Yeah, Gwen, I'm leaving. I'm done. I didn't wait for her to say anything else. I turned around and walked upstairs, packing the last of my things. I wasn't going to fight with her. I wasn't going to drag it out. I was just going to leave and let her deal with the fallout. By the time I left the house, I was already halfway to being free. I signed the papers, packed my bags, and never looked back. The next chapter of my life began in a sleek, industrial loft on the other side of town. No more suburban home, no more reminders of Gwen or the life we'd built together. The loft was cold, almost empty, just bare walls and open space. It felt fitting. I didn't want comfort. I wanted isolation. The first few nights alone, I barely slept, not because I missed her, hell no, but because the silence was so loud. It pressed in on me, making me feel like I was suffocating. My mind would race through everything that had happened, the betrayal, the lies, her cold confession that she'd been unhappy for months, that she had wanted out for so long. It gnawed at me, a bitterness that settled into my bones. Work became my salvation. I threw myself into it, taking every opportunity to travel. The more I was away, the better. Cities blurred together: New York, Chicago, Miami, even international trips to Europe and Asia. Every new place felt like a chance to escape the mess I'd left behind. It didn't matter if I was working 12-hour days or grabbing red-eye flights. As long as I stayed busy, I didn't have to think. With the long hours and constant travel, relationships were out of the question. I'd had my fill of that anyway. I had no interest in letting another woman into my life, no interest in opening myself up to that kind of vulnerability again. The way I saw it, love was a scam. A way to suck you in, bleed you dry, and leave you gutted. But I wasn't a monk. I had needs. That's where the escorts came in. At first, I felt a strange kind of guilt about it, like I was doing something wrong. But the more I indulged, the easier it got. The detachment was the key. No emotional strings, no expectations. I paid for their time, their bodies, and then I moved on. There were no false promises, no pretending, no betrayal. It was transactional, clean, and that's exactly how I liked it. It wasn't about pleasure, not really. It was about control. I called the shots. I decided when and where, and when it was over, they left. No messy emotions, no lingering attachments. Just a brief escape from the anger that always seemed to simmer just beneath the surface. I started to build a routine around it. Business during the day, meetings and networking events, and then at night, I'd find someone who could make me forget for a little while. I never asked their names, and I never cared to know. They were just passing shadows, brief distractions before I got back to the real world. But even that started to feel hollow after a while. I'd find myself lying awake in hotel beds, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was it. Was this what my life had come to? A series of meaningless encounters, punctuated by long hours at work, and a deepening bitterness that I couldn't seem to shake. The truth was, I didn't care. I didn't want more. I'd had more, and it had cost me everything. Eventually, I started collecting motorcycles, vintage ones, rare models. I spent obscene amounts of money tracking down bikes from all over the world. It gave me something to focus on, something tangible. The sound of a finely tuned engine, the feel of the leather beneath me. As I took a corner, it was the closest thing to freedom I'd ever felt. Out on the road, with the wind in my face and the world flying by, it was easy to forget. The loft slowly filled with bikes' restored beauties, their chrome gleaming under the lights. Each one had a story, a history, but none of it mattered. They were mine, and no one could take them away from me. Unlike the relationships I'd had, these bikes were solid, reliable. They didn't lie, didn't cheat, didn't pretend to be something they weren't. In time, I became known for my collection. People in the motorcycle community would reach out to me, offering to trade or sell rare models. I even had a few guys in my network who'd try to scout out pieces for me on their trips abroad. It became an obsession tracking down the rarest bikes, restoring them to perfection. It was a distraction, sure, but it was also something I could control. Work was going well, too. I climbed the corporate ladder quickly, my dedication to the job making me indispensable. Promotions came along with bigger paychecks. The more money I made, the more I invested in the things that mattered: my bikes, my freedom, and my distance from anything that resembled emotional attachment. Every time I walked through the door of my loft, I'd feel the same sense of relief. No wife waiting with hidden resentments, no kids needing attention, just me and my machines. The quiet was no longer suffocating, it was welcome. It was my fortress, and no one could breach it. I started to look at people differently. My co-workers, the people I networked with, it was like I could see right through them. The smiles, the handshakes, the polite conversations, it was all bullshit. Everyone had an angle, something they wanted, something they were willing to lie and cheat to get. I was just better at spotting it now. I'd learned from the best. Women, in particular, became something I avoided unless I was paying them to leave. They reminded me too much of my mother, of Gwen, of every woman I'd ever known who had taken something from me. The lies, the manipulation, the constant need for more. I wasn't falling for it again. I remember one night, after a long business trip, I stood on the balcony of my loft, looking down at the city below. The lights stretched out for miles, cars moving like tiny ants through the streets, and I felt nothing. No joy, no sadness, just a deep, aching emptiness. It was strange. I had everything I'd ever wanted: money, freedom, success. I'd rebuilt my life from the ground up on my own terms. And yet, it all felt so hollow. Every dollar in my bank account, every bike in my collection, every meaningless encounter, it didn't fill the void. It didn't erase the damage that Gwen had done, or the scars left by my mother's betrayal. The truth was, I had shut myself off from the world because it was the only way I knew how to survive. But the cost of that survival was becoming clearer every day. I had distanced myself from everyone, from relationships, from trust. And in doing so, I'd lost the ability to feel anything real. There was no happiness, no sadness, just a bitter reflection of the man I had become. I was alone. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if that was a victory or a defeat. The knock on my door was so out of place, it startled me. No one ever knocked on my door. My loft was my sanctuary, my fortress of solitude, and I'd kept it that way for years. It had been almost a decade since Gwen and I split, and in all that time I had managed to keep people, especially her, at arm's length. So when I swung the door open and saw her standing there, looking smaller, more fragile than I remembered, I froze. For a moment, it felt like I was staring at a ghost. Gwen hadn't aged well. The years had worn her down. There was no trace of the confident, carefree woman who had once stood in front of me with her head held high, breaking my heart without a second thought. Now she looked tired, her hair dull, her face gaunt and pale. She seemed out of place, standing in the cold, empty hallway outside my door, like she didn't belong there. Hell, she didn't belong in my life anymore, and I was about to tell her exactly that. "What do you want?" My voice was cold, detached. I couldn't afford to let any part of the past creep back in. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. Her hands trembled slightly as she fidgeted with the strap of her purse, her eyes flickering up to meet mine with a look I couldn't quite place, something between desperation and regret. "I need to talk to you, Julian," she finally said, her voice shaky. "It's important." I crossed my arms, blocking the doorway with my body. "I don't have anything to say to you. Whatever you want, the answer is no." "It's not about us," she said quickly, her voice rising in panic. "It's about Laura." The name hit me like a gut punch. Laura, I had no idea who she was talking about, but the way she said it like it should mean something to me made my skin crawl. "Who the hell is Laura?" I snapped, my patience wearing thin. Gwen swallowed hard, her eyes filling with tears, though she tried to blink them back. She's our daughter, Julian." Time stopped. My head spun, the world around me tilting as the words sank in. "Our daughter." I stood there, numb, trying to process what she had just said. It felt like someone had knocked the air out of me, and for a few moments I couldn't speak. What the word barely escaped my lips, my voice tight with disbelief. "Laura," Gwen said again, her voice softer now. "She's 9 years old, Julian. She's your daughter." I didn't tell you." "I know I should have, but..." "You didn't tell me." I cut her off, my anger flaring up again, boiling over into something ugly. "You kept a child from me. You didn't think I had the right to know that I had a daughter. I didn't think you'd care," she cried, her voice breaking. "After everything that happened, I didn't think you'd want anything to do with me, with a child, with any of it." "You're right," I spat, my fists clenching at my sides. "I don't want anything to do with you, but a child? My own daughter. Jesus, Gwen, you robbed me of that. You took away my chance to be a father." I know," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face now, "but that's not why I'm here. I didn't come to dredge all of this up. I'm here because Laura needs you." My anger was burning white hot, but something in her voice stopped me cold. There was a deep, hollow fear in her words that I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I hated her. "She has leukemia," Gwen whispered, her voice breaking on the word. "It's bad. She's been going through treatments, but they haven't worked. We need a bone marrow transplant, and the doctors think you might be the only match." I stood there, frozen, my mind spinning. My daughter? I had a daughter, and she was sick, dying, even, and I hadn't known. I didn't know if I was angrier at Gwen or at myself. For all the times I had thought about my future, my life, I had never once imagined something like this. "How long have you known?" I asked quietly, my voice shaking with fury. "How long has she been sick?" "A year," Gwen replied, wiping her eyes. "We've tried everything, Julian. The treatments, chemo, nothing's worked. We're out of options. She needs you." For a moment, I considered slamming the door in her face. Part of me wanted to shut it all out, to reject this entire nightmare. After everything she'd done, Gwen didn't deserve my help. But this wasn't about Gwen, it was about Laura, my daughter. "I'll get tested," I said, my voice tight. "But don't think for a second that this makes up for what you did." Gwen nodded, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you, Julian." The test results came back a week later. I was a match. It felt like a cruel joke. A part of me had almost hoped I wouldn't be. It would have been easier to walk away, to leave this mess behind. But no. Fate had other plans. I was the only one who could save her, and as much as I wanted to pretend I didn't care, I couldn't. The first time I saw Laura, it nearly broke me. She was lying in a hospital bed, her small body hooked up to machines, her skin pale and sickly under the fluorescent lights. But her eyes were bright, curious, and innocent in a way I didn't deserve. She didn't know who I was at first. Gwen had told her I was a friend from the past, someone who was helping. It was only after I agreed to the transplant that she would be told the truth. I stood at the edge of the room, feeling like an intruder. Gwen hovered near the bed, gently brushing Laura's hair back as she spoke to her softly. There was so much I wanted to say, but none of the words came. I just stared, feeling the weight of everything I'd missed. "Hi," Laura said suddenly, her voice small but steady. I blinked, startled by the sound. "Hi," I replied, awkwardly stepping forward. "I'm Julian." She smiled weakly, and for a moment I saw myself in her stubbornness, her strength. It hit me like a punch to the gut. This was my daughter, my flesh and blood, and I had no idea what to do. I was a stranger to her. The days leading up to the procedure were a blur. I sold off most of my motorcycle collection, the bikes that had once been my solace, to cover the costs. I didn't care anymore. The bikes meant nothing compared to this. I sat by Laura's bed, talking to her, trying to make up for lost time. She didn't know who I really was yet, but it didn't matter. I needed to be there. Gwen stayed nearby, watching but never saying much. The tension between us was palpable, but we both knew this wasn't the time for old wounds. Laura needed both of us, and for now, that was all that mattered. When the day of the transplant finally arrived, I was terrified. Not for myself, but for Laura. What if it didn't work? What if it wasn't enough? The thought of losing her before I even had a chance to know her was unbearable. The procedure itself wasn't as bad as I'd imagined. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional turmoil I had been through over the past few weeks. But lying in that hospital bed, knowing that my bone marrow could be the difference between life and death for my daughter, it put everything into perspective. After the transplant, all I could do was wait. Wait and hope that the marrow would take, that her body would accept it. I spent every moment I could by her side, watching as her small body fought for survival. And as I sat there, day after day, watching over Laura, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led me here. The years of bitterness, the anger, the loneliness I had clung to for so long, it all felt so small now, so meaningless. I had been robbed of the chance to be a father. But maybe, just maybe, I could still find a way to make things right. The beeping of the hospital monitors faded into the background as I sat next to Laura's bed, staring at the small, fragile figure in front of me. My daughter had just survived one of the most intense battles of her young life. The bone marrow transplant had worked. The doctors said she was in the clear, but it would take time for her body to recover fully. I still couldn't believe she was here, that I was here. Every day I sat by her side, watching her slowly regain her strength. It felt more surreal. How could I have spent nearly a decade not knowing she existed? How had I allowed myself to live with so much anger and isolation, thinking that was all life had to offer? One afternoon, as I sat there quietly, watching her sleep, Laura stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and she turned her head towards me, smiling that small, tired smile of hers. "Hi, Dad." My heart stopped. She had only started calling me that a few days ago. At first, I wasn't sure how to respond. I didn't feel like a dad, not yet. But every time she said it, it felt a little more real. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "How are you feeling?" She shrugged, her small shoulders barely moving under the blankets. "Tired but better, I think." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "You're strong, you know that. Stronger than anyone I've ever met." She grinned, her eyes lighting up. "Like you." I looked away for a moment, trying to gather myself. How could she look at me like that, with such love and trust, when I had missed so much of her life? I didn't deserve it, but she gave it freely. "I don't know about that," I said, my voice cracking, "but I'm trying." There was a long pause, the room filled with the soft sounds of the hospital. Then she spoke again, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm glad you're here, Dad." That broke me. I felt the weight of every mistake, every lost moment, every bitter thought crumble inside me. I leaned forward, gently taking her hand in mine. "I'm glad I'm here too, Laura. I'm sorry I wasn't before. I'm so sorry." Her small hand squeezed mine, and she looked at me with those bright, innocent eyes. "It's okay. You're here now." The simplicity of her forgiveness shattered the walls I had spent years building around myself. All the bitterness, all the anger, it seemed so insignificant now. Laura didn't care about the past. She only cared that I was with her now, and that was enough for her. It had to be enough for me too. Gwen's presence had been harder to accept. She hadn't left the hospital since Laura's condition had worsened, staying in a small room nearby, so she could be close at all times. I had avoided her whenever possible, keeping our interactions limited to curt nods and brief exchanges of information about Laura's progress. But there was no avoiding the reality that we were both here for the same reason, and for Laura's sake, we needed to figure out how to coexist. One evening, after the doctors had told us that Laura was officially in remission, Gwen approached me as I sat in the waiting room, staring at the dull gray tiles under my feet. "Julian," she said quietly, sitting down next to me, I wanted to thank you. For everything. For stepping up for Laura." I didn't look at her. I couldn't. There was still too much between us, too many wounds that hadn't healed. "You didn't give me a choice," I muttered. "I know," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "and I'm sorry for that. I should have told you from the beginning. I should have handled everything differently." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Handled it differently? Gwen, you kept my daughter from me for 9 years. How the hell am I supposed to forgive that?" She was quiet for a moment, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Julian. Not now, maybe not ever. But I'm asking you to see that I didn't do it to hurt you." I was scared. Scared of what you would think, of how you'd react. I was selfish, I know that. But I never wanted to take her from you. Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken truths. I wanted to scream at her, to make her understand just how much she had stolen from me, from Laura, but the truth was, I didn't have the energy for that fight anymore. All I wanted now was peace for Laura's sake, if nothing else. "Look," I said, finally turning to face her, "I'm here for Laura, that's it. I don't want to fight with you, and I don't want to rehash the past. We're here now, and she needs both of us, so let's just focus on her." Gwen nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I agree. That's all I want too." As the weeks passed, Laura's recovery brought us all closer together in ways I hadn't expected. We fell into a routine, Gwen and I taking turns staying with Laura at the hospital, making sure she had everything she needed. Slowly, the tension between Gwen and me started to ease, replaced by a tentative understanding. When Laura was finally discharged, she still needed constant care and monitoring. Gwen suggested something that, just months ago, I would have scoffed at. She asked if she and Laura could move into my loft, at least temporarily, until Laura was fully stable. I hesitated at first. The idea of sharing my space, my sanctuary with Gwen again made my skin crawl. But it wasn't about me anymore. It was about Laura. So, I agreed. The loft felt different with them there. For so long, it had been a place of isolation, a fortress where I could hide from the world. Now it was filled with life again, Laura's laughter, her quiet conversations with Gwen, the sound of her small footsteps padding across the hardwood floors. It was strange, but not in a bad way. It was healing, in a way I hadn't expected. Gwen and I were civil, careful not to step on each other's toes. We didn't talk much about the past or what had happened between us. That wound was still too fresh. But we worked together. For Laura, Colorado parenting wasn't easy, but we were both committed to making it work. Laura's happiness came first, and that meant finding a way to move forward, even if it meant setting aside our own issues. One evening, after Laura had gone to bed, Gwen and I sat on the balcony, watching the city lights below. It was one of those rare quiet moments when we weren't focused on Laura's recovery or her next round of treatments. "I never thought we'd be here," Gwen said softly, breaking the silence. "Neither did I admitted, taking a sip of my drink. "But here we are." She nodded, pulling her jacket tighter around her as the cool night air brushed past us. "Do you think we'll ever be able to really talk about what happened between us?" I stared out at the city, the familiar bitterness rising in my chest, but it wasn't as sharp as it had been before. "Maybe," I said, my voice low. "But not now." "Okay," she whispered. "I understand." And for the first time, I believed her. Months passed, and Laura's health continued to improve. She was back to being a normal, energetic kid, her laughter filling the loft with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. She started calling me Dad more often, and each time it chipped away at the walls I had built around myself. I was still learning how to be a father, but I was getting there, slowly. As for Gwen, our relationship had changed. We weren't the same people we had been when we first met, and the scars of the past still lingered. But we had found a way to coexist, to be parents to Laura, and that was enough for now. The bitterness I had held onto for so long towards Gwen, towards my mother, towards life in general was starting to fade. It didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, like peeling back layers of anger and hurt, one at a time, until there was something softer underneath. Something that resembled forgiveness. Not for Gwen, not yet. But for myself. Laura had given me that.